Hello, everybody, to my talk, Making the Web a More Reactive Place with RxJS, and I'm RxJS-Web, and I'm very happy to talk about this very topic. As already announced, RxJS-Web is kind of like my little baby so far, and I'm trying to take care of that, even though I should take more care of it partially, but we will come to that later. So first of all, to introduce this properly, RxJS is a library for composing asynchronous and event-based programs by using observable sequences. That sounds good, and it's actually the reason why I came up with RxJS-Web. Because web APIs are mostly asynchronous or event-based. So I thought like, okay, why not make them observable-based? And I soon noticed that web APIs are not really reactive and their API design could be better, partially. I'm not blaming anyone here, but there are some problems that you will face when working with web APIs. And with RxJS-Web, I try to mitigate that. I got already pretty much introduced, so I will just skip that slide. And before we dive deep into RxJS-Web, I quickly want to recap what web APIs are, because this term is like fairly vague, right? So when we are developing web applications, our browser is the runtime. So we will send, or we have JavaScript files in the end, even though we're developing TypeScript. And our browser is interpreting it and executing it. And therefore, we can add behavior to our browser runtime. Many people of you might already be familiar with the V8 engine, for example, that is implementing the ECMAScript standard. So everything you find in the ECMAScript standard will be implemented in the V8 engine and therefore will be available in Node.js, for example. For web APIs, they're not part of the ECMAScript. They're more like features, nice, convenient features provided by your browser. So because I'm using Chrome, I wrote here Chrome, but that's pretty much sums it up. So you're using your browser and the browser supports that kind of API. And the web API is actually fairly extensive. And one of the standard APIs that you're probably already using is the DOM API. It's not part of the ECMAScript standard. It's part of your browser, and it comes with your browser. And for example, another web API is event listeners, or adding event listeners is part of the web API specification. And web APIs are actually pretty great. So you can develop really immersive web applications with those. So for example, imagine Google Maps, right? You're dependent on the geolocation API. You have to have this kind of information where the user is located right now. Or imagine the Twitter PWA. Particularly for PWAs, web APIs are the way to go, as you're not relying on native OS features, but on web features. So you can still just ship JavaScript code. And Twitter is actually using a lot of features from a lot of web APIs. So you have vibration, you have geolocation, you have service worker, you have web workers, and so on and so forth. And when you start using web APIs, it goes fairly well in the beginning, right? It feels good, you're making good progress, but then you hit certain troubles and it's getting problematic and kind of ugly, and it will hurt you, I promise you. So let's quickly recap on some of the structures, and this will make some of the problems of web APIs pretty visible. So more or less, to sum it up, there are two different kinds of web APIs. So you have web APIs that return a single value, like, for example, there is within the geolocation web API, there's one method that returns you the current position. Those kind of single value operations will usually return a promise. Therefore, it's always asynchronous. And there are also APIs that return multiple values. So if we stick with the example of geolocation, there's also one watch position that keeps you updated with changes to the position and therefore use callback mechanism. And I already tackled that promises are always asynchronous. So even though you're performing a synchronous task, whatever, the promise will make it an asynchronous execution. And callbacks, if I remember correctly, at least when I started in the JavaScript ecosystem, callbacks were like, oh yeah, that's super ugly to read. We can't do that. Please, let's do something else. Both of them kind of like cancellation. It's getting better on the promise side with cancellation tokens or async controller, abort controller, but still the API is not that well supported so far. And my biggest problem with all of those approaches is actually a general lack of composability. So you can end up in callback hell, and you can for sure use promise all with a bunch of async await, but that does not make it readable and good to compose. And therefore, I have here an example showing how much composing web APIs suck. In this example, I use a native implementation with using @EventListener to implement the drag and drop feature. And drag and drop is pretty much a composing of mouse click, mouse move, and mouse up. And you have to do these weird JavaScript things that I, as a TypeScript developer, usually freak out about. I'm like, why do I need to reference this? Why do I need to pass this method reference and bind this context to that? Well, because it's terrible otherwise to do it. So this was the reason, or therefore I figured out that web APIs don't have a unified interface, right? Sometimes it's promise, sometimes it's callback. And Ben Lesh, in one of his more or less recent blog posts, said observables are a unified API that can represent a wide variety of things. For example, events, multiple values, single values, etc., etc. And this describes perfectly why I think observables, and therefore RxJS, is way better for web APIs than promises and callbacks. So I came up with RxJS-Web. You can check it out on this GitHub link. And you can already use it. But what I wanted for this library is actually to provide an observable wrapper for web APIs. So I didn't want to simulate just the behavior of web APIs. What I wanted to simulate observable behavior. What does that mean? Usually promises are eager executed. So as soon as you reference it, it's get executed, and then you just get the value out of that as soon as you're calling the then method. Well, observables are lazy. Therefore, it's executed every time you subscribe to that, for example. This kind of behavior is added within that library to make it more natural for users that are familiar with RxJS. You can use it already. It's right now in alpha. I said it, I'm a slacker, and I should take a little bit more care of that. But you can use it already with npm install RxJS-Web. And I will also show some examples, some scenarios where I think RxJS-Web is a good approach. So one use case, for example, is like a weather app, right? So you still have geolocation API, which makes it a very good fit. And actually, the whole weather app business is based on this information. Where am I right now? I have rarely, it's sometimes happened, but most rarely I look up how's the weather somewhere else. And then it's also just because I want to go there. Usually it's like, okay, I'm at this place, how's the weather here, right? So within this geolocation example, because StackBlitz is trolling me a lot with the geolocation API, I created a ticket for that a while back, but therefore I recorded it to have it visible in this slideshow. But you see here in the demo that I'm changing the location, and therefore it gets already reflected due to the observable in my UI, and it will fetch the new data for geolocate. So it's actually it's two HTTP calls. One is for geolocation to actually city, and one is then for city to get the temperature. So there are two different web API, HTTP APIs providing that information. So the code for that kind of looks like that. I hid a little bit of the details within how to get the city codes and something like that. But what I wanted to show here is that RxJS-Web provides a from position method that you can use to subscribe to position changes of your user. And you will get then a geolocation object representing or having information like latitude, longitude, etc., etc. In my example, I wanted to render the current city, so that's what I used here with the tab. The geolocation example that I have implemented here shows the automatic update, which you just get when using watch position, I think is the API. It also supports cancellation, which is pain in the ass with promises usually. On top of that, it supports a permission request, as those web APIs also include that you request the permission of the user. So the user has to grant you access to that kind of information. And this is already handled just by using from position. And it would throw an error when the user say, nope, I don't want to share this information with you, which would kind of destroy the whole example here. But for this example, it worked great. I also did not implement error cases, like, for example, what happens if the user does not grant me access to this API. It's possible with RxJS-Web. I was just too lazy to do it, to be honest. You can check out this example by RxJS-Web GearLocation with this link. I will share the slideshow afterwards on Twitter. So as soon as this bar is gone, you can see my Twitter handle. You can, like in an hour or something, I will share the slideshow so that you can check it out and take a look at these examples. On top of that, I also implemented something like a loading skeleton, which was very fast now, but pretty much we're using the mutation observer API to render elements. And as soon as we have, in the meantime, while we are fetching data, we are showing this tiny loading information, loading skeleton. So Slack is, for example, one brand or one company that is using that heavily for their application. You can, didn't I have the code here? Okay, let's quickly jump into Slack, into StackBlitz to take a look at the code. It's using it's actually fairly a lot of code, but what I'm doing is I'm rendering 3 elements, and then I'm using the mutation observer to get notified about changes in the child list that I use to perform HTTP calls. And while I'm performing the HTTP calls, I'm adding this class name to start the skeleton kind of thing, like this thingy. That was, by the way, all my CSS skills that I have. So don't expect any more CSS skills from me. I was very proud when I got this animation on. I'm actually still very proud about it. And then as soon as the response is there, I'm removing the class name and displaying the text. This is kind of like I implemented this loading skeleton with RxJS-Web and the mutation observer API. The last example I want to show is dynamic fetch. And as a consultant, I'm used to prepare heavily sophisticated diagrams to prove my point. And a dynamic fetch is, for me, check the network condition. If it's good, load many items. If it's not good, load just a few items so that the user can still see something. Highly sophisticated diagram, but it proves my point. And you can implement dynamic fetching in a fairly comprehensive manner with RxJS-Web. So RxJS-Web also supports the network API, which gives you information about the current network conditions of your user. So for example, what network type he's running on. So I used first here because from network also usually tracks network condition. With first, I'm just getting one value at a time, because otherwise the switch map would be triggered every time the network condition will change. Anyway, we are then checking the network conditions. And if you're running on 2G, I just want to load the first 20 elements from my REST point. If I'm running on a better network condition, I want to load the first 50. This is a very, it's pretty much just an example. But if you're considering like news app, for example, you want to show that your user something, even though he's running on low network. And you could do this with this API so that you just load the first 1 or 2 news entries. This is actually a pretty good approach. It's also using the FromFetch API, which is, even though it's kind of a web API, part of RxJS core, but I will talk about that in a minute, why this is the case. Again, I prepared this StackBlitz link, so you can check it out afterwards and play around with it. So far, RxJS-Web supports those APIs listed here. So pretty much everything every web API that has observer in it is supported by RxJS-Web. Due to amazing contributions, we have also support for speech recognition and speech synthesis. I hope I pronounce this right. I doubt it though. The PR for Bluetooth is still open, so RxJS-Web will also support Bluetooth API. It supports dynamic import, so you can use RxJS-Web to dynamically load JavaScript files at runtime. Additionally, we have media queryless, which you could use for dark theme support, for example. I already teased the network API and the position API. Under the hood, we are also using the permission API for, at least for the position and the sensor API, but it's also exposed. So if you want to request permissions for your applications, you can use from permission for that. And on top of that, there's also the sensor API, which you could use if you're developing IoT application or something like that. I would actually be super interested in seeing usages of those, because I don't have IoT devices. I should, just to develop that, should get Philips Hue lights to play around with it. But right now I don't have. So this is what is right now supported. Bluetooth, again, is a little bit grayed out because the PR is open. We are working on it, but it's not merged yet. I intentionally did not have web workers listed here. There was a PR for that, but there's actually an amazing library already that supports web workers with RxJS in a very, very extensive way. So this is amazing what those folks did there to support web workers and with everything you can do. So they even have like worker pull strategies and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, give that library a check out. Yeah. One thing that is actually missing why RxJS-Web is still in alpha so far is that it's lacking it's not lacking test capabilities, it's lacking a lot of tests. Before I want to release it in a stable version, I want to prove by automated tests that everything is working. But due to the fact that we are relying on web APIs, it's pretty difficult to test some of the stuff. And I'm also a little bit of a slacker. So I should actually, this is a real footage of me writing some of the tests. It was partially very painful. I think I got a handle now. Yeah, but this is actually the only thing that is really missing for RxJS-Web to be released in the first stable version. Before we come to an end of this presentation, I want to use this slideshow and this presentation to thank all the contributors. These folks did amazing. So just to get a quick shout out, Sasha did amazing with designing the logo for RxJS-Web. And I'm so bad at designing, like I'm so thankful for that. And all those people did really valuable contribution, and I couldn't be more thankful for that. So very last point, and this is actually interesting. So why is this not part of RxJS core? Even though we already have from event, for example, and from fetch in RxJS. So the thing is, RxJS already comes with 105 operators in its latest beta, if not even more. We generally try to reduce the API surface of RxJS and not create more operators. We do consider creating or providing new operators if it's difficult to provide to implement that on your own, or it's difficult to implement that in a third-party library. And actually, everyone within the RxJS core team has some kind of third-party library providing added features for RxJS. So Nicholas Jamieson has RxJS ETC. Ben Lesh created something for support async iterables. OJ has something for improving the test scheduler, and so on and so forth. And now RxJS-Web is my little baby, and I'm very much looking forward to see it grow in usage, but also in features. And that's actually all I've got. I really appreciate being here today. I like this meetup a lot, so thank you very much for having me. If you have any question afterwards or want to check out the repository, I added the link here. And for questions, you feel free to ask them now. I'm very happy to answer them. But you can also always reach out to me on Twitter. So I think my DMs are open, so feel free to drop me a message if you have any kind of question afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan-Niklas.